On December 7th, 1971, police were called to the List family mansion in Westfield, New Jersey. Neighbors had seen the home's lights, which had been on day and night, slowly blinking out, and no one had seen anything or anyone for almost a month. Officers made their way into the mansion through an unlocked window that led to the basement. Something horrific was waiting for them inside. The bodies of 84-year-old Alma, 46-year-old Helen, 16-year-old Patricia, 15-year-old John Frederick, and 13-year-old Frederick were all found with gunshot wounds. But one member of the family was missing. Where was John List? Police soon found that no one had seen John since early November, and he wouldn't turn up anytime soon. 18 years to be exact.
Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe. Thanks for listening today, and today's episode is going to be a validation of sorts. For all of us that really get into true crime more than people think is okay, if there's someone in your life that makes fun of you for playing internet sleuth, play them this episode. It's an Uno reverse card. Knowing what's going on in the world around you is a good thing, and that good thing can lead to the capture of a murderer, like we're going to talk about today. Before we get all the way going with it, look at where you're listening right now. Make sure you are subscribed to 10-Minute Murder. And when you subscribe, it's almost like magic. The weekly episodes appear right before your eyes. You don't have to go searching for them. Also, scroll down and find the show notes of this particular episode. You'll see links for a variety of things, including where you can connect with me on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and stuff like that. I know that if you're like I am, when you're listening to a true crime podcast, as soon as it gets going, you wonder, what do these people look like? I need to see their faces. It's similar to when someone cuts you off in traffic. You want to catch up to them and see what kind of idiot you're dealing with. Same kind of thing here. So I post photos that relate to each episode on Facebook and Instagram. You don't have to go looking for those. Okay, now to today's story. John List was born in Bay City, Michigan. He was an only child to German-American parents and took after his father in many ways, particularly in religion. John was a devout Lutheran and became a Sunday school teacher. He graduated from Bay City Central High School in 1943 and enlisted in the United States Army that same year and served as a laboratory technician during World War II. John was discharged in 1946, and he enrolled at the University of Michigan and got his bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's degree in accounting. But John's military days weren't over just yet. In November 1950, John was recalled to active military service as the Korean War started to escalate. While at Fort Eustis, Virginia, John met Helen Morris Taylor. Helen lived with her daughter Brenda, close by to Fort Eustis. Sadly, she had lost her husband while he was fighting in Korea, and John and Helen got married on December 1st, 1951 in Baltimore, Maryland. And it's crazy to think that almost exactly 20 years later to the day, police made that gruesome discovery. Realizing that John had some accounting skills, the Army changed his listing to the Finance Corps. He completed his second tour in 1952 and moved on to working for an accounting firm in Detroit. John got another job opportunity as an audit supervisor at a paper company in Kalamazoo, which he took. And this is where his 3 children were born: Patricia, John Frederick, and Frederick. John continued to move up in the world over the following years and managed to make his way up to general supervisor of the company's accounting department. Things for Helen, let's just say they weren't going quite as well. Helen battled with alcoholism and by 1959 had become increasingly unstable. Brenda got married in 1960 and moved out of the home that same year. John then moved the family to Rochester, New York, so that he could start another job. This time, it was Xerox. Here, he worked his way up to Director of Accounting Services. Yet another job came up in 1965 when John was offered the position of Vice President and Comptroller at a Jersey City bank. This is when the family, which included John's mother, wife, and children, were moved into Breeze Knoll. And when I say it was a mansion, I'm not kidding. Many people, when they get a good deal of money, they're usually kind of nonchalant about it. But this house was very chalant. I know that's not how that word works, but it was a large Victorian-style home with 19 rooms located at 431 Hillside Avenue in Westfield. On the outside, things seemed to be going pretty well for the Lists, but on November 9th, 1971, things apparently went very, very bad. John List went on to murder his entire immediate family using his 9mm semi-automatic handgun and his father's Colt .22 caliber revolver. Helen was the first to be murdered while the kids were at school, with a single shot to the back of the head. Next, it was his mother, Alma, who was killed with a shot above her left eye. John then waited for Patricia and Frederick to get home from school before shooting each of them in the back of the head. That left one more target, John Frederick. But first, what was the only logical thing to do? Have some lunch, of course. Once John had finished eating, he drove to his bank and closed his and his mother's bank accounts. Then he drove to Westfield High School and watched John Frederick play a game of soccer. John then drove his son home before shooting him repeatedly. There was evidence that pointed to John Frederick having tried to defend himself, hence the extra gunshot wounds. With his whole family now dead, John left the bodies of his wife and children in sleeping bags in the mansion's ballroom. Did I forget to mention earlier that he had a ballroom? I don't know what kind of accountant balls out to the point that they have a ballroom, but John List had one, and that's where he left his family. Aside from his mother, he put her body in the apartment in the attic. John addressed a 5-page letter to his pastor that was later found on his desk, where he said he saw too much evil in the world and that killing his family would save their souls. John cleaned up the mess left behind at the crime scenes and left a radio tuned to a religious station. The final thing he did, John removed his own picture from every single family photograph in the house. And then he bounced. Like I mentioned at the start of this, the List family bodies were only found on December 7th, and this meant that John had almost a month's head start. And you might think a decision to up and kill your whole family is done on a whim, but John was meticulous in his planning in his days before the murders. John had sent notes to the kids' schools and their part-time jobs to say that they would be visiting their sick maternal grandmother in North Carolina for a few weeks. This part was true. The sick grandmother, I mean. Helen's mother had been actually planning a trip to Westfield, but had canceled due to her health. Turns out this was a blessing in disguise for her. As John later admitted, had she arrived, she would have been the 6th victim. John also went so far as canceling all of their mail, newspaper, and milk deliveries. The neighbors knew the Lists as a reclusive bunch, but it was pretty strange even for them when the lights never went off and no one was ever seen coming or going. This was when the police were called and the bodies were found. Unsurprisingly, a nationwide manhunt was launched for John List. Police followed up on countless leads but had no luck. Remember when I said John had been meticulous? Well, the fact that he had removed all of his own photos from the home made it a whole lot harder to find him, since people didn't know who to look out for. The family car was found at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City, but police didn't believe that John had actually gotten onto a plane. Grand Breeze Knoll stood cold and empty until it went up in flames in August 1972, 9 months after the murders. The official report ruled it an arson, but the case remains unsolved with no suspects. I'll leave you to speculate who may or may not have been involved there. In this fire, the ballroom's stained glass skylight, which was rumored to be assigned Tiffany Original, was destroyed. That alone would have been worth about $620,000 today. And I'm sure you're wondering where John ended up at this point. The FBI later discovered that John had taken a train from New Jersey to Michigan and then Colorado shortly after the murders in 1971. So he did leave his car at JFK to throw off the police. He settled down in Denver in early 1972 and assumed a new identity, Robert Peter Clark, or Bob. We'll call him Bob for this part of the story. Here, Bob took on an accounting job. From 1979 to 1986, Bob worked at a paper box manufacturer near Denver. And during this time, Bob joined a Lutheran congregation and ran a carpool for church members. At one of the Lutheran gatherings, Bob met an Army PX clerk, Dolores Miller. The two got married in 1985. In February 1988, Bob and Dolores moved to Midlothian, Virginia, to a house in the Brandermill neighborhood. Bob again worked at an accounting firm. But things were soon going to come crashing down for Mr. Bob Clark after America's Most Wanted broadcast the 18-year-old crime in May of 1989. In what was a segment in the show's very first season, an age-progressed clay bust was shown of John List that had been sculpted by forensic artist Frank Bender. Frank luckily knew what he was doing, and the bust happened to look a lot like John's actual current appearance. On June 1st, 1989, a little less than 2 weeks after the show was broadcast, John List was arrested at a Richmond accounting firm after a former Denver neighbor recognized the description and contacted authorities. John List / Bob Clark stood by his alias for months, even after he was extradited back to New Jersey in late 1989. Finally, Bob Clark / John List couldn't deny it any longer after his fingerprint was matched to John List's military records. On February 16, 1990, John confessed to his true identity. Not that it was much of a shock to anyone at this point. He testified at his trial that he was having severe financial difficulties in 1971 after he was laid off when the Jersey City bank he worked at closed. John found this humiliating and wanted to avoid his family finding out at all costs. So, despite no longer having a job, he would get dressed and leave the house every single day as if he was going to work. Instead of going to the bank, John spent his days at job interviews or reading newspapers at the Westfield train station. Keeping up with the mortgage payments on that mansion was obviously a pretty costly thing to do, so to keep from defaulting on those loans, John skimmed money from his mother's bank accounts. This is also around the time he encouraged his children to get part-time jobs to teach them responsibility, he said. In actuality, it was to help keep the family afloat. Added to all of this, John had Helen's alcoholism to deal with, as well as a case of untreated syphilis, which she had contracted from her first husband and had kept secret for 18 years. Trial testimony said that Helen pressured John into marrying her by lying about being pregnant before insisting that they get married in Maryland. Why Maryland? Because the state did not require a premarital syphilis test that most other states required at the time. She got sicker and sicker, but still said nothing to John or her doctors until 1969, when a thorough workup revealed the condition. At this stage, the lovely cocktail of being an alcoholic and having syphilis had taken its toll on Helen. Quote, transformed her from being an attractive young woman to an unkempt and paranoid recluse, someone said in the trial. Helen humiliated John all the time in public by saying that he was not as good in bed as her first husband was. A court-appointed psychiatrist testified that John List was suffering from an obsessive-compulsive personality disorder and that in his mind, there were only two options: accept welfare checks or kill his family and send their souls to heaven. Welfare was not an option to John. He reasoned that this would expose him and his family to ridicule and go against his father's teachings of how to care for and protect your family members. On April 12, 1990, John was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder. At his sentencing, John denied direct responsibility for what he did and said, quote, I feel that because of my mental state at the time, I was unaccountable for what happened. I ask all affected by this for their forgiveness, understanding, and prayer. The judge didn't agree, and John was sentenced to 5 terms of life imprisonment. John List is without remorse and without honor. After 18 years, 5 months, and 22 days, it is now time for the voices of Helen, Alma, Patricia, Frederick, and John Frederick to rise from the grave, the judge said. John's story is disturbing as it is interesting, and there's no doubt he was suffering from some sort of mental health issues at the time, but regardless of that, there's no excuse for what he did to his family. He eventually expressed some remorse for the crimes, saying, quote, I wish I'd never done what I did. I've regretted my action and prayed for forgiveness ever since. And John was later asked why he didn't commit suicide. He answered that he wouldn't get into heaven that way. On March 21st, 2008, John List, aged 82, died of complications from pneumonia while imprisoned at St. Francis Medical Center in Trenton, New Jersey, finally bringing his story to an end. That's today's 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. Thanks for being a part of it today, and before you go, make sure you're subscribed to 10-Minute Murder, connected on social media. Links are in the show notes, or you can just as easily go to any of the places that you want to follow or connect with 10-Minute Murder. Type it into the search bar, and it'll pop right up. If you've got friends and you think they may be into brief true crime stories like this one, let them know about 10-Minute Murder. Thanks for listening. Be safe, and have a good night.